She stood at the bottom of those courthouse steps with nothing left. No money, no name anyone in that town would speak kindly of, and a little girl pressed against her side who hadn't said a single word in 3 days. Clara Weston had walked 4 miles in worn-out boots to get to that sheriff's office. 4 miles of dust and heat and shame she swallowed down because she had no other choice. She had a letter in her hand. Evidence, she thought. Proof that the man who had taken everything from her had done it deliberately, coldly, without a single moment of regret. She had knocked on that door with her chin up. She had laid that letter on the desk with steady hands, and Sheriff Harold Briggs had looked at her, looked at that letter, and slid it right back across the desk without reading more than 2 lines. "Ma'am," he'd said, leaning back in that chair like she was a mild inconvenience between him and his lunch, "I don't involve myself in domestic disputes. Whatever trouble you found yourself in, I suggest you find your way out of it the same way you found your way in." She had asked him again, quietly, carefully. She had told him about her daughter, about the land that had been taken from her late husband's name through a forged document, about the man who had threatened her, who had told her to leave the county by Friday or face consequences she didn't want to imagine. The sheriff had stood up. He had walked to the door. He had held it open. And Clara had walked back out into that hard Texas sun with her daughter's small hand in hers and nowhere left to turn. If you've ever felt like the person who was supposed to help you simply looked the other way, then stay with me, because this story is for you. And if you love these slow, heartfelt Western stories, make sure you subscribe before we go any further, because we release new ones every week, and you don't want to miss what's coming. Now let me take you back to where this really began. Clara Weston was not a woman who asked for help easily. She had been raised by a father who believed hardship was just life's way of teaching you something, and she had carried that belief deep in her bones through 32 years of living. She had buried her husband Daniel 2 winters ago, taken over the small piece of land he had left behind, planted through grief, harvested through exhaustion, and raised her daughter Rosie alone, without asking a single soul for so much as a borrowed cup of flour. Rosie was 6 years old and had her father's dark eyes and her mother's quiet stubbornness. She collected smooth stones from the creek and named every one of them. She had a gap in her front teeth and a laugh that could make even the most tired day feel lighter. And for the last 3 days, since the night a man named Doyle Mercer had come to their door and said the things he said, that laugh had gone completely silent. Doyle Mercer was not from the county originally. He had arrived 2 years ago with money and confidence and the kind of smile that made men trust him at card tables. He had bought up land, lent money at rates that trapped people, and slowly made himself into the kind of man that other men in town were careful not to cross. He had set his eye on the Weston land because it sat right between 2 of his properties, and he had decided, quietly and without mercy, that he was going to have it. The forged deed had appeared 3 weeks after Daniel's death, filed with a county clerk who asked no questions and accepted an envelope that was not discussed out loud. Clara had found out about it only when a neighbor came to warn her, hat in hand and apology in his eyes, saying he was sorry, but Doyle Mercer was saying the land now belonged to him and that Clara had 2 months to vacate. She had spent those 2 months fighting. She had written letters. She had found a lawyer 2 towns over who had taken her case, then quietly dropped it after a visit she was not told about. She had gathered what evidence she could, including the letter from a man who had witnessed the original filing and written down what he saw. And then she had gone to Sheriff Briggs, and Sheriff Briggs had held the door. So now Clara stood at the bottom of those courthouse steps with Rosie pressed against her side and a long Friday deadline hanging over her head and no plan left in the world. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying in public was something that invited either pity or cruelty, and she didn't want either one. She just stood there for a moment, one hand on Rosie's shoulder, looking out at the street with the particular expression of a woman who is figuring out her next move, even when she is certain there isn't one. "You need somewhere to go." The voice came from behind her, low and even, and not unkind. She turned. He was leaning against the post at the base of the steps with his arms crossed and his hat tilted just enough to shade his eyes. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of quiet stillness about him that comes not from laziness, but from a man who has learned to be very still before he decides to move. He wore a plain shirt, worn boots, a belt with no show to it, and a revolver that sat on his hip with the comfortable ease of something that had been there a long time. His name, she would learn in the next 60 seconds, was Amos Cole. And he was not the sheriff. He was not a lawman of any kind. He was a rancher who owned the piece of land directly to the north of hers, and he had been sitting in that courthouse waiting for a land survey appointment when he had watched, through the window, the way Sheriff Briggs had opened that door. He had seen her walk back out. He had picked up his hat and followed her. "I don't know you," Clara said, which was both a fact and a warning. "No," he agreed, "but I know Doyle Mercer, and I know what he does to people who have something he wants." He paused. "And I know your land." She studied him for a moment. Rosie had turned and was looking up at him with those dark, quiet eyes, and he looked down at her with a steadiness that was not forced and not performed. He just looked at her the way a person looks at a child, with care and without expectation. "She hasn't spoken in 3 days," Clara said. She didn't know why she told him that. It just came out. "That's all right," Amos said. "She doesn't have to." Something in Clara's chest pulled tight and then loosened in a way she didn't have words for. She did not go with him that day. She was not a woman who trusted easily or quickly, and she told him so plainly. He nodded like he understood that completely and wrote down the name of his ranch and how to find it, and said if she changed her mind, or if Friday came and she needed somewhere safe, the offer stood. She spent the next 2 nights at the edge of her property, sleeping poorly, watching the road, listening to Rosie breathe in the dark and telling herself she could figure this out on her own. On Thursday night, 2 men rode past her fence line slow enough to make it clear they were looking. One of them stopped and stared at the house for a long time before they moved on. Friday morning, Clara packed what mattered: Rosie's stones, Daniel's photograph, a change of clothes for each of them, the letter. She hitched the small wagon and she drove north. Amos Cole's ranch was not grand. It was solid and old and clean in the way that working places are clean, where everything has a purpose and nothing is wasted. There was a main house with a wide porch, a barn that smelled of hay and horses, a garden that someone had planted with more care than ceremony, and a dog named Hatch who came trotting out immediately to investigate Rosie with the kind of tail-wagging seriousness that only old dogs manage. Rosie looked at Hatch for a long moment. Then she sat down in the dirt and let him put his head in her lap. Amos stood on the porch and watched that happen, and Clara watched him watch it, and she saw something move through his expression that he did not entirely manage to hide. Something careful and old and a little bit broken. She learned later that he'd had a daughter once. She had been taken by fever 3 years ago. Her name had been May, and she had been 4 years old and she had loved dogs. He did not tell Clara that himself. She heard it from his ranch hand, an older man named George who had been with Amos since before the fever, since before the marriage, since before all of it, and who spoke about it the way people speak about a wound that is healed over but left a scar you still feel when the weather changes. Amos had offered Clara and Rosie the back room of the main house. It was clean and private with a window that looked out at the hills, and when Clara stood in the doorway looking at it, he said simply, "It's yours as long as you need it," and then walked back out to the barn without any further discussion. She appreciated that. The lack of discussion. The absence of strings being attached out loud. But she was not naive. She knew that a man did not offer his home to a strange woman and her child without reason. And she knew that their presence on his land and the proximity of her property to his was not a coincidence that served only her. She brought it up that evening at the kitchen table. "If I stay here," she said, "and Mercer comes, he comes here." Amos was looking at the table map he'd drawn out, showing both their properties and where they connected. "He was already coming here," he said quietly. "He just needed you gone first." He told her then what he hadn't said on the courthouse steps, that Doyle Mercer had been trying for 2 years to acquire the land corridor that would give him water access to the eastern pastures. That corridor ran through the Weston property and through the southern edge of the Cole Ranch both. That if he took her land, he could start making moves on Amos's next. That her fight and his fight were not entirely separate fights. Clara absorbed that. "So you need me," she said. "I could fight him alone," Amos said. "I have before. But 2 deeds are harder to fake than 1, and 2 witnesses are harder to silence." It was not a romantic declaration. It was not soft or sweet or dressed up in any kind of feeling, but Clara found she respected it more for that. He was telling her the truth plainly, and he was letting her make her own choice plainly, and that was more honesty than she had received from most people in the last 2 years. She stayed. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was strange at first, and then gradually not strange at all. Clara helped with the cooking. She worked in the garden with the kind of focused attention that came naturally to her. She went over the legal documents with Amos in the evenings, comparing what she had with what he had, trying to find the thread that could unravel Mercer's filed claim. Rosie began to talk again on the fourth day. Not much. A word here, a question there, mostly to Hatch. But then gradually to George, who had an endless supply of stories about horses, and then one morning, quietly, to Amos himself. He had been at the fence mending a post when Rosie came and stood beside him and watched. After a while, she said, "Why do fences have to be fixed so much?" Amos had kept working as he answered, which Clara noticed he always did with Rosie, never stopping what he was doing to make a production of the conversation. "Because things push against them," he said. "Wind, animals, time. Things always push against fences. Doesn't mean you stop fixing them." Rosie thought about that. What if the fence doesn't want to be there? Then it was put in the wrong place to start with, he said. Rosie seemed satisfied with that. She picked up a stone from the ground, turned it over in her hand, and set it on top of the post he had just repaired. He looked at it. He looked at her. He didn't smile, not quite, but there was something around his eyes that was soft in a way that Clara had not seen in him before, and she had to turn away from the kitchen window because something about watching it made her throat feel tight. She told herself it was gratitude. She told herself it was relief. She told herself a great many things in those days that she was not entirely sure were true. The trouble came on a Wednesday, as trouble often does, without any particular announcement. Mercer had not let the deadline pass quietly. When he found that Clara had not vacated, and when his men reported back about where she had gone, he shifted his approach. He filed a secondary legal motion claiming that the Weston property had reverted to the county upon abandonment, with Clara's departure used as evidence of that abandonment. He had the filing pushed through the same clerk in one day. He also paid a visit to the ranch. He came in the afternoon with 2 men behind him and a smile that belonged on someone who believed very deeply in his own power. He rode up to the porch where Amos was standing, and he spoke pleasantly and calmly, and said he had no quarrel with Amos personally, and that if Amos chose to remove himself from what was essentially a legal matter between Mercer and a former squatter on legally contested property, there would be no difficulty between neighbors going forward. Amos said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That woman is not a squatter. That child is not a problem for you to solve, and you are on my land, which means you leave when I tell you to leave." Mercer's smile didn't change, which meant it was never a smile at all. "I'd think very carefully about what you're choosing here, Cole." "I have," Amos said. "Leave." There was a long moment where the air felt like it does before lightning. Then Mercer turned his horse and left, and his men followed, and the sound of hooves faded down the road. Clara had been standing just inside the door. She had heard all of it. She stepped out onto the porch and stood beside Amos and watched the road for a moment, and then she said quietly, "He's going to come back harder." "Yes," Amos said. "That didn't slow you down." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, it didn't." What happened next came from Amos's mind, but Clara would later say it also came from something she couldn't quite name. The way the right solution sometimes appears when 2 people have been quietly thinking toward each other without realizing it. He brought it up carefully that evening. He sat across from her at the table, and he said that there was one way to complicate Mercer's legal strategy significantly. If Clara's name was legally joined to his, the Weston property could not be classified as abandoned by a single claimant, and the combined landholdings would represent a unified deed that was far harder to challenge piecemeal. It was not the only way, but it was the clearest and fastest one. Clara looked at him for a long time. "You mean marriage?" she said. "On paper," he said, "for legal purposes, to protect the land, both pieces of it." She looked at her hands. She thought about Daniel. She thought about Rosie. She thought about what it would mean to sign her name next to a man she had known for less than 2 weeks, even a man who had drawn that line in the yard without a second thought. "And what do you get from it?" she said, "besides a legal complication for Mercer?" He was quiet for a beat longer than she expected. "Company," he said finally. "This house has been very quiet for 3 years." She did not say yes that night. She told him she needed to sleep on it, And he nodded and said, "Of course," and went out to the barn to check the horses. And she sat at that kitchen table for a long time in the lamplight, thinking about fences and the things that push against them, and what it meant to put one in the right place. She said yes in the morning. The ceremony was small and practical, performed by a justice of the peace in town who asked no unnecessary questions. George was the witness. Rosie wore her best dress and held her smoothest stone in her pocket, and stood very straight, as if she understood the gravity of the occasion, even if she could not fully name it. Afterward, walking back to the wagon, Rosie reached up and took Amos's hand. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The legal challenge moved forward. Clara and Amos filed a combined deed response with documentation that Clara had assembled, and a second witness affidavit that George had quietly helped locate, the man who had originally written that letter, finding his courage again when he learned he would not be standing alone. The county judge, faced with a properly filed joint claim, a legitimate witness statement, and the lack of any actual evidence of abandonment, denied Mercer's motion. Mercer's smile, when he heard about it in town, did not reach his eyes. He did not come back to the ranch. He would cause more trouble in the months ahead, smaller trouble, the kind you manage and endure, but the land was not taken. The land held. And somehow, in the space of all of that, so did something else. It did not happen quickly or dramatically. It happened the way most real things happen, gradually, almost without noticing, in small moments that accumulated weight like stones in a pocket. A hand steadied at a difficult moment. A look across the kitchen table that lasted one beat too long. An evening on the porch where neither one of them spoke, but neither one of them left either. The night Clara finally said what she had been not saying. It was raining softly outside and Rosie was asleep, and the house was warm and quiet. She had been trying to read and not reading, and she finally put the book down and said, "Amos, I think I should tell you something." He had looked at her from across the room with that still, patient way he had. "This doesn't feel like only paper to me anymore," she said. "I don't know when that changed, but I thought you should know in case it changed for you too. And if it didn't, that's all right. I just didn't want to keep not saying it." He set down what he was holding. He crossed the room. He sat in the chair beside her and looked at her in that quiet way that was not distance, but was instead a kind of fullness, like a man who is not used to having something good and is being very careful with it. "It changed," he said. "It changed the morning she put that stone on my fence post." She understood that. She understood exactly what he meant. That it wasn't about her alone, that it was about the three of them, about this shape that had formed without any of them planning it, about the thing that Rosie had already decided with the certainty that only children carry. In the spring, Rosie came running in from the yard where she had been collecting new creek stones to show Amos something she'd found, and she burst through the kitchen door and called out across the house in that clear, bright voice of hers, the voice that had been so silent once, that had been so still, the voice Clara had prayed to hear again. She called out, "Mama, where's Papa? I need to show Papa." Clara stood at the kitchen window. Outside, the land stretched out green and wide in the early morning light, the fence lines holding, the hills the same color as hope. She pressed one hand to her mouth and let herself cry. The good kind, the kind that doesn't require an audience, the kind that comes when the thing you were afraid to wish for turns out to be exactly where you are standing. Amos came in from the barn a moment later, and Rosie launched herself at him with the stone, chattering about where she'd found it and what shape it was and what she thought it looked like, and he listened with his whole self the way he always did, and over Rosie's head, his eyes found Clara's across the room. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Some things don't need saying when they are already true. If this story touched something in your heart today, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments what part stayed with you the most, or share where in the world you're watching from. I read every single comment, and it always means something to know that these stories are reaching you. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do, because we have more stories just like this one waiting for you. Stories about quiet love and earned trust, and the kind of belonging that nobody can take away. We'll see you in the next one.